Look at the back of this aircraft, because it is drawn wrong. The tail is in two pieces and both of them are standing in the propeller wash. That is the whole trick. A rudder can only push against air that is moving over it, so at very low speed, a normal tail goes soft in the pilot's hands. This one never does. The propellers keep feeding it. It holds full control at a crawl, in the exact regime where other aircraft turn into passengers. That tail is a confession. The engineers were not designing something to travel, they were designing something to stay. It is called the OV-10 Bronco, and it first flew in 1965. In 2015, two of them were taken out of retirement at NASA and sent to northern Iraq to find out what staying was worth. 82 days, 63 rockets across 41 engagements. That is the whole combat record. And in it, two aircraft older than their pilots did what the most sophisticated targeting architecture ever assembled could not do reliably. They were already overhead when the call came, and they answered it themselves. This is classified Decoded. We don't ask what an aircraft can do, we ask what problem it was built to solve. And the problem these two Broncos solved was never a shortage of firepower. The United States had firepower over Iraq in enormous quantity. Bombers, strike fighters, armed drones, and A-10 Warthogs built for exactly this kind of work. All of it overhead, all of it lethal. The problem was time. Specifically, the time consumed every time a piece of information has to travel from one machine to another before anyone is allowed to act on it. Every transfer is a delay, and delay is what decides whether air power overhead means anything at all. March 2002. Operation Anaconda. An American element is inserted onto a peak in eastern Afghanistan called Takur Gar and lands directly on top of a prepared enemy position. In the open, on high ground, against defenders it cannot clearly locate. There was no shortage of aircraft over Afghanistan that day. There was a shortage of the right aircraft at the right moment. And the American military has been studying that difference at every level since. The problem it found was not propellers versus jets, it was arithmetic that the standard way of doing business had made almost invisible. Three separate jobs stand between spotting a target and doing anything about it. And in this kind of war, they almost never belong to the same aircraft. Somebody has to find it. An aircraft listening for radio and phone signals picks one up and works out roughly where it came from. A rough location, nothing more. Somebody has to confirm it. A drone is sent to watch and to make certain of who is actually there. And somebody has to act. A fighter jet, orbiting somewhere else entirely, is called over to release the weapon. 3 aircraft, 3 crews, 3 chains of command. And between each of them, the information has to be described, approved, and handed to someone who was not there for the step before. Every transfer is a small tax on time. Not a failure, a tax. That tax, compounding, is the enemy of this story, the handoff. And it cannot be beaten by buying better equipment, because every capable new machine you add is one more link in the chain. A better sensor is another handoff. A better shooter is another handoff. The stronger the force grows, the longer the answer takes to arrive. An enemy generated by our own abundance. In 2015, U.S. Special Operations Command decided to attack the problem from the opposite end. Instead of adding a better link, they went looking for an aircraft that could do all 3 jobs alone. And the first thing such an aircraft has to be able to do is refuse to leave. Which brings us back to that tail. Because before staying is a tactic, it is an energy problem, and the answer depends entirely on what you are asking the engine to do. A turbofan converts fuel into velocity with tremendous efficiency, at high speed and high altitude where it was designed to live. Ask that same engine to hold station over a single city block at low speed, and it burns enormous quantities of fuel doing something it is bad at. A propeller makes the opposite bargain. It moves a large mass of air slowly rather than a small mass quickly, which is exactly what you want when the requirement is endurance rather than distance. A jet is paid to arrive. A turboprop is paid to stay. And when a situation develops on the ground, the useful aircraft is rarely the one that can get there fastest. It is the one that was never anywhere else. Over 82 days, the two Broncos flew 477.3 hours across 134 sorties. That averages roughly 3.5 hours in the air every time one of them left the ground. But the number that matters is not its size. It is what the number does not depend on. 3.5 hours sustained without a tanker overhead, without a second aircraft rotating in to cover the gap, without anything else in the sky scheduled around it. The Bronco's presence over a target was not a slot in a coordination plan. It was a fact for as long as the crew chose to make it one. To buy those 3.5 hours, we gave up nearly everything else. Speed first, which means this aircraft never races to a developing situation. It is only useful if it is already there, which is precisely why it is built to stay there. Altitude next, which puts it inside the reach of small arms, and any pretense of surviving a serious integrated air defense. Put this aircraft over an opponent with modern radar-guided systems, and the physics turns against it immediately. That constraint defines exactly where this machine belongs. Against an enemy that has no such systems, the trade is enormously favorable, and the Bronco spends the entire fight collecting on it. One more figure makes the rest of it work. Across those 82 days, in desert conditions, the detachment achieved a 99% sortie completion rate, with 15 people. All of it. The whole program. Loiter time is worthless if the aircraft cannot make it off the ramp when the radio call comes, and this one nearly always could. Being present, though, is not the same as being useful. What made these two aircraft dangerous was what happened inside the cockpit while they were up there. Follow a single engagement, step by step. It begins with a signal. Each Bronco carried a system called Airborne Precision Geolocation, a signals intelligence package that can detect and track a specific individual from the emissions of a cellular or satellite phone. Feed it a digital identity, and it produces a position on the ground, updating in real time. In the standard architecture, this is the first handoff. The location goes to a command center, which tasks something else to look. On the Bronco, nothing is passed anywhere. The crew rotates the sensor turret. That turret is an L3 Westcam MX15 HD, a high-definition electro-optical and infrared ball with a laser rangefinder and designator built in. Its most important quality is not magnification, but stabilization. It strips out the vibration of the airframe so completely that the picture stays locked on a fixed point while the aircraft moves around it. Day or night, the crew can zoom until they can tell who is carrying a weapon and who is not. Normally, this is where the second handoff occurs. On the Bronco, the same two people who found the signal and confirmed the picture now fire the laser designator and release the weapon. That weapon is the APKWS-2, a 70mm rocket with a semi-active laser guidance kit built around it, riding the beam the aircraft's own turret is projecting. Find, confirm, engage. 3 functions that normally live on 3 separate aircraft, executed across about an arm's length. A sniper does not radio a second man to confirm the target and a third man to pull the trigger. The eye, the judgment, and the finger belong to one person. That is what makes the shot precise. The crews earned a nickname for exactly this reason. They were called flying snipers. So why not the A-10? It was already there. 12 Warthogs had been in theater since late 2014, flying 11% of all U.S. Air Force sorties in the opening 2 months. And by almost every measure of firepower and protection, the Warthog is the superior machine. But look at where it sits in the chain. The Warthog carries no geolocation package. It cannot find the target itself. Somebody else has to hand it one. It is the third job, the acting, and a magnificent one. But it is still one job out of 3, still waiting on the 2 that come before it. And with a single seat, the pilot flies the aircraft, works the sensor, and works the radio simultaneously, which caps how long anyone can study a street before acting. The Bronco was never the better attack aircraft. It was the aircraft that needed nobody else in order to act. That closed loop cost something real, and it is worth naming plainly. It puts two human beings inside the range of every weapon on the ground below, which is a price a drone never pays. The crews understood that trade completely and took it. Over the deployment, they employed 63 APKWS rockets across 41 engagements, roughly 1.5 rockets each, a picture of restraint rather than a claim about marksmanship, describing an aircraft that resolves a situation with 1 or 2 placed shots because it has the time to look before it fires. The precision itself comes from geometry. A 10-pound warhead riding a laser beam can be put through a window or under an awning in a dense neighborhood. A 500-pound bomb, however accurately delivered, takes the building and a good portion of the street. In urban terrain, the size of the warhead is what decides whether a target can be engaged at all. But every piece of equipment described so far can simply be bought. The turret is off the shelf. The rocket is a standard munition with a guidance kit bolted on. The geolocation system is in wide use. So why did this experiment work when the components were available to everyone? The answer starts with a question that sounds like a personnel matter rather than an engineering one. Who was allowed to sit in these aircraft? 6 aircrew flew Combat Dragon 2. Every one of them was a weapons school instructor. Top Gun, the FA-18 Weapons School, the Fleet Replacement Squadron, the Naval Aviation Warfighting Development Center. The weapons systems officers came out of the Tomcat and Super Hornet communities. All 6 were qualified forward air controllers, airborne, and 4 of the 6 had done the job from the other side, as Special Operations Fire Support Officers and Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, some as instructors and evaluators. Embedded with ground teams in Iraq and Afghanistan, they had worked the radio from the receiving end, requesting the aircraft rather than flying it. Read that again, because it is the specification that matters most on this aircraft. The man pressing the button had once been the man making the call. That is not sentiment. It is the last delay in the chain, and the only one left after the other 3 have been removed. A request coming up from the ground is rarely a clean target description. It arrives in fragments from someone who can only partially see the situation himself. A crew that has never worked that end of the radio has to ask clarifying questions, and every question is time. A crew that has worked it already knows what is being asked, often before the sentence is finished. Measured against a handoff between aircraft, this is a small delay. It is also the one nobody had thought to design out. An interpreter who has only read the language will give you the words. One who has lived where it is spoken will give you what was meant. Over a radio, the distance between those two is measured in minutes. This is where the cost figure finally becomes relevant, in one specific sense. The Broncos flew for roughly $1,000 an hour. In an architecture where a fast jet runs into the tens of thousands, that difference is not a budget story. It is an authority story. An aircraft that cheap does not need to be justified, husbanded, or apportioned. Nobody has to weigh whether this particular situation is worth launching it. It simply goes. And the decision to send it never becomes another link in the chain. And that forces an admission. Some of what those 82 days proved was not about the airframe at all. It was about 6 exceptionally qualified people, hand-picked from the best the Navy had, and you cannot buy that in quantity. 6 weapons school instructors with ground experience do not scale to a fleet of 75 aircraft. Remember that limitation. It is the reason this model was never rolled out across the force, and it is a separate problem from the one that killed the aircraft itself. The measure the crews were graded against reflects exactly this. Across the deployment, the detachment met the ground force commander's intent in more than 80% of engagements, and that figure only means something once you know who was grading. The judge was the commander on the ground. The people being judged had spent years as that commander. By now, an objection should be forming, and it is the strongest one available. If the closed loop is what has value, why put people in it at all? Mount the same geolocation package, the same sensor turret, the same laser-guided rocket on a drone. It loiters longer, it costs less, it puts nobody inside the range of a rifle. The MQ-9 already carries this exact class of equipment, and its operator also watches the screen and releases the weapon. Where is the extra link? The answer is that what got compressed into those two seats was never the equipment, it was authority. And authority is not a thing you can bolt to a pylon. A drone operator sees an image, high fidelity, stabilized, current, and by every technical measure possibly better than the one in the Bronco's cockpit. The Bronco crew sees that same image plus two things that do not travel down a data link. Hours of unbroken watching, which is how a crew knows the vehicle in the alley was not there this morning. And years on the other end of the radio, which is how a crew knows what is meant rather than what was said. Neither of those is a sensor. What could not be replicated onto a drone was not hardware. It was a person who already had the answer before the question finished being asked. Go back to the first number in this story, and it now reads differently. 3.5 hours of endurance sounds like a fuel statistic. It is a measure of understanding. A 20-minute pass cannot produce that knowledge at any resolution, with any sensor, at any budget. Loiter time does not buy presence, it buys context, and context is the raw material authority is made of. So the real lesson is not buy turboprops. In this kind of war, effectiveness is not measured in firepower per sortie. It is measured in the number of links between seeing and acting, including the last one, sitting in the cockpit. The results went up the chain. CENTCOM assembled the case and briefed the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. 2 aircraft, 15 people, 82 days, 99% availability, and a record graded by the supported units themselves. And then the Broncos were handed back to NASA. That was the second problem. Scaling the crews was hard. Scaling the aircraft was impossible. The last Bronco came off the line in 1976, and the type left U.S. military service in 1994. The tooling was cold long before these two ever reached Iraq. Reopening it had been studied more than once, and the arithmetic never worked without a large, committed order nobody was prepared to place. 2 aircraft won the argument on the merits and lost it to an accounting problem no amount of combat performance could touch. The idea outlived the airframe. The OA-1K Skyraider 2 and the armed Overwatch program built around it are direct descendants of those 82 days. And that aircraft has its own story on this channel. The Pentagon spent more than a decade arguing about whether an aircraft like this was worth having. It was settled by 2 airframes borrowed from a space agency, and the answer cost almost nothing because it had been sitting in storage the entire time. The hard problem was never finding the solution. It was recognizing one that had already been built, flown, retired, and parked.